how do I understand the Bible? How do I know where to find things in the Bible? How do I interpret it effectively and correctly? We're going to go over those dynamics in this video. Now, this is a part of a larger series called The Disciple. If you go on our channel, Bethel Pittsburgh, and go under playlist, you'll find a playlist labeled The Disciple. In there, we walk through all the ins and outs of how to be a strong follower of Jesus Christ and effective in your faith. And it's placed in category order. So they're not in alphabetical order. There's select categories that the videos are organized into. And this category is on Bible knowledge. You'll note that there are, I think it's 2 to 3 videos above this one. I think it's 2 videos above this one that we walk through some different parts to understanding how we got the Bible and how to understand it and know what's in it. And we had talked about that the Bible is in divisions. It says in, I think, one of the Timothy letters, which I referred to in the last video on Old and New Testament, Paul says to Timothy that elders are to be able to rightly divide the word of truth. Now, some translations will say handle, but others say rightly divide the word of truth. That I know that there's divisions in the Bible, not that it's opposed to itself, but there are certain sections, and I need to know that in each section there's a certain way to look at it and a certain way to interpret it and a certain way to handle it. Also, when I know the sections, when I'm looking for something, I'll easily know where to go to rather than being stuck with the Bible is a very large document, and it's not so easy to just say, I want to know what to do with prayer and just find it. And the more we understand the categories that are in the sections that are in the Bible, the better we're going to be able to move through and throughout it. So, as I had mentioned, there's an Old and New Testament, and then in each testament there's about 4 sections in each of those testaments. So in the Old Testament, the first section is called the Law. Now, the Law is typically referring to the first 5 books in the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Sometimes they're referred to as the Torah by Jews often. Torah sometimes means the entire Old Testament. Sometimes it's referring to those first 5 books. The books of Moses is another way to refer to them because they're all believed to be written by Moses. Or the Pentateuch, which it comes from penta, meaning 5. So the Pentateuch is another way to refer to those first 5 books. And we have to know that, first of all, what's in there to be able to interpret it correctly. So there's a lot of chronological history there, predominantly because of Genesis, because Genesis goes from creation all the way to about 2000 BC. And so depending on how old the earth is, at its youngest stage, 6,000, so that's 4,000 years of human history, even though it's very selective and just very small parts of it, or much longer than that. And so all of that's sitting in the book of Genesis, and you have some history in the other parts of it as well, but that's what you have. You have Genesis covers a lot of history. When you get to Exodus is a mixture. There's some parts of it that are detailing out the history of Moses' the enslavement, Moses' life, and then the confrontation of Pharaoh, the deliverance, and then some of the things that are happening in the wilderness. But you get portions in Exodus that are the law. Then you get Leviticus that predominantly is just going over law and the requirements for different things, especially setting up and running of the tabernacle. Then you get to Numbers, which is mostly detailing out of what's happening during the wandering in the wilderness before they get to attempt to overthrow or take over the promised land. And then Deuteronomy is predominantly a retelling of the law to the next generation because God allowed the first generation to die out in the wilderness as a form of judgment. And the new generation was getting ready to go into the promised land, and Moses retells them the law. So you get sections in there that are the law. One book, two books, two of the three are predominantly law. The third one has some law, and then two of them are predominantly narrative. And so you have that portion. And what we have to realize is there's two primary literary styles: narrative and prescriptive. So narrative means stories, whether they're historical or not, which in this case they're historical. It's a telling of stories. And when you're going to interpret stories, we have to realize that we're sitting in narrative, and I have to know all the different parts that are happening and why they're happening, what's the full picture of the context. And when I attempt to apply it to my life, do I have the same context that they do? And is this something that was specifically directed at a specific time and a specific group of people? Or is it a cross principle that crosses generational and lines from person to person? And so that's an exercise that I have there, because there are a number of things that are happening there that were specifically happening to the ancient Jews. And the same kind of dynamic happens with the law portions. Now, the law is prescriptive, so we're being told what to do, but I have to evaluate, why was this prescribed? Now, I'm not just going to guess. I want to use the text to tell me. But why was it prescribed? Was it prescribed for a temporary time? Was this fulfilled or not? Or does it still apply as an eternal principle? And so those are the things I'm needing to know, the dynamics that are sitting there, and ask those questions before I just run with a statement that I find in those first 5 books. Then, if it does have too many trappings where it's specifically focused and all of those things, it doesn't mean it's not usable. I just have to do some work in the interpretation. And it might be usable in the sense that it's demonstrating how God behaves. It's demonstrating what God doesn't like, what he expects of us. It demonstrates how God works, or at least can work in humanity. And then that's how we can springboard into taking the right thing out of that. So that's the first Old Testament section is the law. The second section are the historical books. That takes us from Joshua all the way to Esther. So Joshua to Esther. And for the most part, as well as that first section, for the most part, this is moving in chronological order, with the exception of Kings and Chronicles have a lot of overlap. They're kind of running parallel with each other. They're running back and forth. One's moving ahead, the other catches up, kind of thing. But there's some overlap in Kings and Chronicles. But for the most part, Joshua to Esther is running in chronological order. And they're historical books, and for the most part, they are narrative in nature. And so the same kind of things we would have done with the narrative and the law, we're going to do with the historical books, in that there are certain things that only applied to them, and God was only specifically doing through them and speaking to them. And so we have to navigate that. We can't just grab a statement out of there and make it do something. We have to know that we're sitting in that space and in that time period, and know what God is doing during that time. Another thing to consider that's happening in the law at times in the historical books, just very infrequently and a lot more seldomly, but it happens in there, and that is the use of poetic language and figurative language. It does happen in those two sections, and so we want to be aware of that and try to catch it when it's happening. It happens more often, and if not predominantly, in the third section of the Old Testament, and that's the wisdom literature. The wisdom literature is Job through Song of Solomon. So a handful of books there, although Psalms is the largest book as far as number of chapters are concerned, at least 150 Psalms there. So Job through Song of Solomon are wisdom literature books. They're written, a lot of it, in poetic ways. They're written figuratively. And so we have to know that those dynamics are happening. Once again, it's like narrative. There's some things that are specific to that individual that's writing and expressing things. There are other things that transcend time, and I have to pay attention to the nature of those things. I have to know that a lot of things aren't literally how they are, And because of that, I have to just kind of have some understanding of poetry and figurative language, especially Psalms, especially Song of Solomon. But even in those other books, there's a need to realize that I can't translate this into a literal sense, and I want to get the nature of it. One of the books in particular that has a special nature to it, and that is Proverbs, even though all of them kind of carry this weight, but especially Proverbs does, and is that Proverbs is an observation of the way God, or is an observation of generalities. This is the way things typically are. They're not promises. And a lot of people read Proverbs as they are promises, and then we kind of get ourselves into setting ourselves up for struggling in our faith because we expected this was a guarantee God was going to work it out this way, and that's not how Proverbs works. They often, most important, do, but they do not always have that flow to it. And so I need to know that nature to Proverbs. So I know that I'm sitting in that section. The fourth Old Testament section is major and minor prophets. It's the prophetic books that go from Isaiah through Malachi. And the reason why they are split up into two subcategories, major and minor prophets. And the reason isn't because major prophets are more important than minor prophets. It's that the major prophets wrote larger volumes. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations is attached to Jeremiah, and then Ezekiel are, I think, 36 chapters and larger, all the way up to 66 with Isaiah. From Daniel on out, the largest book, I think, is 14 chapters, and there was even one, Obadiah, that is just one chapter, so those are much smaller volumes of work. But nonetheless, they still carry the same kind of characteristics and features to them. They're prophesying issues that specifically have to do with, they're sitting in the time period of the kings. Some of them are pre-exilic, that it's prior to the exile happening where the Jews were attached. First it was Israel, second it was Judah, that they were attacked and taken captive. Some are exilic, that they're prophesying during this time of exile, and then some of the Jews returned, and some are post-exilic, they're prophesying after the exile. And I have to know that a lot of what's being said in there has to do with those events centered around the exile. And if I don't pay attention to that reality, I'm going to run with a statement and do something with it that wasn't intended. And so I have to know that that's what's happening in this section. Much of it is centered around warning them that the captivity is coming if they don't change their ways, and then later explaining why it happened and how they should respond now that they've gone through that exilic period. So I need to know those things so that I'm doing the right thing. Some poetic stuff will show up and surface there, some diction, some narrative. So a lot of those different things show up, but that's the nature of these dynamics. So those are the four sections in the Old Testament. Again, law, historical books, wisdom, literature, major and minor prophets. The four sections in the New Testament mirror that kind of setup. The first section are the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are similar to the law in that this is where Jesus is teaching his new law. He's teaching this is the way followers of Christ behave. And just like the law, you have a mixture of teaching and prescriptive language, as well as some narrative historical stories of what's happening, and I have to do certain things with that, just like I would with the law, and so I have to follow that. Now, the difference is in the New Testament, like I mentioned in our previous video, there's not as much that's been fulfilled here as in the Old Testament, so most of what's there is now relevant. So that's the first section, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The second New Testament section is the historical section, the book of Acts. And that works just like the historical section in the Old Testament, but it's just the New Testament smaller, so there's fewer books for the various sections. But Acts is a telling of the history of what happened. I want to be careful not to use the book of Acts as definitely prescriptive, because a lot of it's just telling me what happened, and I have to do some interpretive exercises to figure out, is this prescriptive? Is this demonstrating the way the church should do it and should do it now? Or is it, there's at least principles there to show us the ideal and show us God's desires, but there's still some exercise to be had there. The third section is the wisdom section of the Bible, which is really the epistles. And that's set up in order of, you put the Paul epistles first, Romans through Philemon. Now Hebrews, some believe it's Paul, some don't, and so it's tacked on at the very end of his list of letters. You will note that they are in general going down in size, Romans being the largest, down to Philemon being the smallest. Then you hit Hebrews, and then you get the remaining epistles by the other apostles and church leaders, from James all the way through Jude. And those letters, they're not as figurative as the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. It's mostly prescriptive, and so it's just telling you really what we're supposed to do. So a lot of the interpretive exercise is more grammatical in that section. The last section in the New Testament, in the Bible as a whole, is the New Testament prophetic section, which is just the book of Revelation. That one, there are a lot of entanglements in that book, and a lot of people make many mistakes with an attempt to interpret that book. A lot of people, that's their favorite book, but it's the most difficult, one of the most difficult Bible books to interpret. When you approach the book of Revelation, we have to realize that some of it is reflecting back on Old Testament prophecy and fulfillment and Old Testament dynamics. Some of it's looking forward to things that were yet to come at the time of the writing, but possibly happened already. Some of them maybe still haven't happened. There's a lot of figurative, apocalyptic, symbolic type language in there, and so we can't just grab a hold of it and make it all literal. And so there's just a lot of exercises, because a lot of the different types of literary styles are all jammed in that book, and a lot of the different sections of the Bible are all jammed in that last book. So I have to know when I'm reading Revelation, there's a lot that I have to do in there. Okay, so those are the sections. So again, Old and New Testament, each of them have law, history, wisdom, and prophetic. If you have any questions on that, or would love to hear your feedback on the helpfulness of this video or the series in general, or if you would just like to grow in your faith in person and you live in the Pittsburgh area, we would love for you to join us at Bethel Assembly of God at 2501 Staten Street, Wednesdays at 6:30 and Sundays at 10 a.m. God bless.